Your money in the bank is not as real as you think. And when I say that, I'm not exaggerating and I'm not talking about a conspiracy. Imagine this for a moment. Every single customer at your bank walks in on the same day around the same time and says, I want to withdraw my money. Within a few hours, the entire system would freeze because that money is not calmly sitting in a vault waiting for you to come and collect it. This is not a bug. It's not an oversight. It's the design. The modern financial system was deliberately built this way. It's so old and so deeply woven into our lives that most of us don't even feel like thinking about it anymore. This system has a name: fractional reserve banking. It is the quiet engine behind global debt, inflation, and what we've been taught to call wealth. Once you truly see how it works, you come face to face with an uncomfortable truth. Money is built on promises that can never be fully kept. Now, before we talk about apps and screens and digital balances, let's rewind the story. Let's go back to a time before numbers lived inside your phone. In medieval Europe, money meant one thing: gold and silver. If you were wealthy, you had chests of coins and jewels you could trade, but carrying a pouch full of gold was heavy, dangerous, exposed. So people started doing something different. They left their valuables with goldsmiths. Goldsmiths had solid vaults, thick doors, and most importantly, reputation. They were the trustworthy men of the town. When you deposited your gold, the goldsmith gave you a receipt, a simple note that said, in effect, if you bring this paper back, you can collect the gold we hold for you. After a while, people noticed something. Instead of going to the vault, dragging the gold out, and carrying it through the streets, they could just hand the receipt to someone else. That little piece of paper represented the gold just as well, and it was a lot easier to carry. So the receipts themselves started to move from hand to hand, from town to town. They began to function as money, and right there is where the trick was born. The goldsmiths noticed something crucial. Out of 100 people who had deposited gold, on any given day, maybe one or two walked in and said, I'd like my gold back. The rest of the gold just sat in the vault, silent, untouched. So the goldsmith began to think, if I have 1,000 coins in this vault, why should I only issue receipts for 1,000? Why not 2,000? Why not more? And so they did. They began writing receipts for gold that did not exist. They lent those extra receipts out and charged interest on them. They were making money on gold that was never really there, as long as everyone didn't rush to the vault. At the same time, no one noticed. This was the first real version of creating money out of thin air. Once people accepted those pieces of paper as just as real as the gold, money creation broke away from the physical world. From that logic, banks were born. The trick was no longer a private scheme. It became an institution. Time moved on. We entered the 17th century, and now it wasn't just goldsmiths playing the game. Kings and governments joined in. In 1694, the Bank of England was founded, not to protect the public, but to solve a problem. The crown was drowning in debt from endless wars. The bank lent money to the government, far more than it actually held in gold. In return, it received interest. That debt wasn't repaid with treasure from new conquests. It was repaid with taxes taken from ordinary people. Sound familiar? Because that mechanism is still with us today. Money that doesn't really exist yet is borrowed into existence, and the bill is handed to future generations. America followed the same path. Early banks in the United States issued notes redeemable in gold, but they soon realized they could print more paper than the gold they actually had. From time to time, bank panics exposed the illusion. Crowds of people rushed to the branches, demanding, "Give me my money!" And they discovered it simply wasn't there. Entire banks collapsed overnight. Yet instead of abolishing the system, governments doubled down. They created central banks to protect the illusion, to stand behind the trick, and keep it alive. The message was clear. Even if the money doesn't exist, we will make sure the public keeps believing it does. Now let's jump to today, because you might be thinking, okay, but that was the old world. Surely the system is different now. Imagine you walk into a bank and deposit $100. You walk out thinking, that money is sitting there now, in my name. For a long time, here's roughly how the system actually worked. The bank kept about $10 in reserve and lent out the other 90. Maybe someone borrowed that 90 and spent it at a grocery store. The store owner then deposited that 90 into another bank. That second bank kept 9 and lent out 81. That money moved again, was deposited again, lent again. By the time this cycle played out, your original $100 had become nearly $1,000 of credit in the economy. But remember, only the very first 10 actually existed as cash. The rest was debt. And if that already sounds strange, today's reality is even stranger. In the United States now, reserve requirements are not 10%, they are. Since March 2020, the Federal Reserve has essentially told banks, you are not required to hold a single dollar in reserve against your deposits. So, the neat little money multiplier is no longer what truly governs lending. So, what does stop banks from lending into infinity? Today, the leash isn't reserve requirements, it's capital rules, and liquidity rules set under a global framework called. After the 2008 crisis, central bankers and regulators met in Basel, Switzerland, at the Bank for International Settlements. They drafted a new rule book, not in your parliament, not in your Congress, but in closed rooms by unelected technocrats. Under these rules, if a bank wants to make a risky $100 loan, it may have to hold $8 of its own equity. As a buffer, the more risky assets it holds, the more of its own capital it must lock away. On top of that, banks must prove they have enough liquid assets to survive a short-term panic, cash, government bonds, things they can sell quickly. All of this is the technical way of saying, don't fly too close to the sun. But pay attention to what changed. Banks don't lend from deposits anymore. They create loans first, and those loans create deposits. When you get a mortgage, the bank isn't moving bills from one drawer to another. It types new numbers into your account. That money exists because you agreed to owe it back. Then, after the fact, the bank checks whether it has enough capital to justify the risk. That's why today, more than 90% of the money circulating in the system is not central bank money at all. It's bank-created money, born as debt. So when you open your banking app and see a balance on the screen, remember, what you're looking at is not the same thing as physical cash. It is a promise, a claim, a number backed by someone's obligation to keep paying. This design has consequences. First, as banks keep multiplying credit, on top of the same base of money, the value of each unit erodes. Prices don't rise only because markets are difficult. They rise because the currency itself is being diluted. Second, since money enters the system as a loan, there's always more debt than there is money to repay it. Interest guarantees that the books never fully balance. Someone must always default, refinance, or borrow more. Third, banks collect interest on money they never truly had. Governments tap into this system to finance wars, social programs, and bailouts. Without obviously raising taxes, Meanwhile, those who own real assets, property, stocks, and commodities watch their wealth grow as inflation pushes prices higher and ordinary workers feel something very different every year. The same paycheck buys a little bit less. When this machine stumbles, the illusion cracks. Think of the Great Depression. In 1929, banks had lent far beyond their reserves, fueling a stock market bubble. When panic hit, people rushed to the banks. "I want my money!" But the money wasn't there. Thousands of banks collapsed. In 2008, we watched a newer version of the same story. This time it was mortgages, bundled and sold as safe investments stacked on promises that could never all be kept. When defaults began to spread, the system nearly imploded. And once again, governments and central banks stepped in, pumping trillions into the system. To keep it alive, they didn't save the illusion. Because it was fair, they saved it. Because without it, the modern economy can't function. And here's the uncomfortable part. This system cannot afford for everyone to be debt-free. If every household at every business paid off all their loans tomorrow, the money supply would collapse. Banks would have nothing left to lend. Economies would shudder to a halt. The illusion depends on you, on your willingness to borrow, to spend, and to trust that the digits in your account represent something real. You are the fuel, and you are the collateral. So what do you do with this? First, remember that money is not the same thing as wealth. Real wealth is not just numbers on a screen. It is land, resources, skills, knowledge, relationships, independence, things that still matter, even if the promises printed on paper start to fail. Second, debt is not neutral. It is the bloodstream of a system designed to favor lenders, governments, and asset owners more than the people who simply work and save. Third, inflation is not an accident. It is baked into the design. Each year, you are asked to run a little faster, just to stay in the same place. This doesn't mean doom is guaranteed, but it does mean you have to rethink your relationship with money. Keeping cash in a bank account by itself won't protect you. Blindly trusting the system won't free you. Building real wealth in things that hold value outside the cycle of inflation and debt is the only path toward financial freedom. The point of this story is not paranoia, it's awareness. If your money is born as someone else's debt, then your freedom depends on how far outside that machine you can afford to stand. History doesn't repeat itself exactly, but it does rhyme. Medieval goldsmiths. The bank panics of the 19th century, the housing bubble of 2008, all different verses of the same song, promises that stretch beyond reality, and a public that believes in them. Until belief is no longer possible. And make no mistake, that this story is not finished. The next time you open your banking app and look at your balance, ask yourself, how much of this is truly there? Was this system built for my freedom, or just so the game can keep going? If this gave you a new way to look at money, hit subscribe, because the answers you're looking for have already been written in history, and I'll be here showing you where to look.